because of those experiences, like with Brian, and just seeing the attitude and the generosity and the just like self-awareness of pros at a certain level that don't really have anything to prove and aren't trying to sort of grandstand. It has made me feel really intentional about the importance of giving information to youth.
I have been sucked into an Instagram vortex by today's guest. What an interesting person, fascinating background, and inspiring individual. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we're talking today with Ian Allison, who was recommended to me by Trevor Jones here on the podcast team. You've heard a lot from Trevor and his scholarship roadmap program recently. Ian did a video, and he does a lot of videos on Instagram about how he records an upright bass and kind of, when we talk about it, we'll get into it, but it was very cool, and I started watching and reading about Ian, and what an interesting artist. And as happens so frequently on the show, we have a lot of shared background, and you'll hear that coming up here. But he's the bassist for Eric Hutchinson. He's a seasoned veteran in the industry, and like I said just a moment ago, he is really doubling down on Instagram, and we're actually going to do a round two. I think we talk about it at the very end of this, about why he's decided to do what he does on Instagram. So that's coming soon, but this part one, we go through his backstory, the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival, which is an inspiration for him to get into music, and was one of the last things I did in person before the pandemic hit. His niche that he sort of created, this synth bass on electric. We talk about that. A practice routine that he outlined for Bass Magazine, and much more. Definitely follow him on Instagram, and let's get into our conversation. How's it going, man?
And it's going so great. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah. What's it like this time of year in Minnesota? You're in Minneapolis area, right?
Yeah, I'm in Minneapolis proper.
You are? Okay.
I'm right in the city. It's pretty nice, but I mean, it's also like super hot and muggy. It can be like 90 with like 90% humidity, full on like mugginess. But right now it's all right, man. 80 degrees. It's all good. I'm going to take the kids to the pool today.
Nice. That's great. I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So
I know Sioux Falls very well.
Yeah, I figure. Okay. So that sort of weather is familiar to me, that muggy,
sure.
And then of course that like late October through early April deep freeze that you typically get.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, it's like a 7-month winter.
Well, I lived in Chicago for a long time, and I thought I was moving to a temperate climate going there, because
sure.
it really, like the snow falls maybe 3-4 weeks later, melts a couple weeks earlier, but yeah, that's no fooling around, that Minnesota winter.
Yeah. Prince used to say that it keeps out the riffraff.
Yeah, it definitely does. Unlike where I live, because I'm in San Francisco now, so it's a very
cool.
And it's amazing how fast that Midwestern backbone like melted away from me here. We've been out here 5 years, and I the first year I remember hearing people complain about the rain. It'll be like gentle rain, like that's the worst that can happen besides earthquakes and other things. But
right.
but then the second year I was here, I started complaining about the rain, and then I saw all these people in puffer coats, which I thought was ridiculous. And about a year ago, I bought my first puffer coat. So, apparently I can't take anything
That's
lower
amazing.
than I know. It's so
That's amazing, man. It's funny. I have a really good friend that that plays with me in Eric Hutchinson's band, a drummer named Brian Taylor, and he's born and raised. He was born, raised in Rancho Cucamonga, so L.A. And he would always, whenever we would do a tour that wasn't in California, he would be like, man, what coat do I need? What jacket do I need for this? Like, help me out. I'm like, dude, it's not going to be that intense. Like maybe just a jean jacket or something. And he's like, I don't know. And he always would carry a puffer wherever we went because, you might get cold. It's great.
Oh,
amazing.
Man. Well, I did the drive from Chicago out to here, and I was so happy. I gave away all my scrapers and all that sort of stuff to my friends in Chicago. Came out here.
It's like a rite of passage.
It was. But then, of course, like a fool, I took a gig playing with the Oregon Symphony, and I drove in like February. And I thought, it's the coast. That's going to be fine. Nope. I got snowed on for like the 2 weeks I was up there in Oregon, and I was scraping my car with my credit card. I never thought I'd be back in that situation. But
of course, man. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, I know. It's yeah, I love it here. There's definitely like weather stuff that I wish, I was like, oh man, I was born and raised in Montana, and that was more temperate as well. But I feel like the secret is the gear. You've got to get a great coat. You got to get great boots. You got to get, and if you have that stuff, you're good to go.
I remember the year before I moved out to San Francisco, Saturday was my day that I could actually just get out and do something. And I love to walk to one of the breweries in Chicago. It was about a 10-mile walk. And then I was rewarded with food and beer, which is always a good reward. And I woke up and I looked at the temperature and it was 0. And I thought, man, don't want to do that 10-mile walk in 0. But I'll tell you what, I put on my wind pants, which nobody knows what I'm talking about except the skiers when I talk about that here. And I put on my face mask and I put on everything and I went out, and those days where it's that cold, it's like too cold for clouds a lot of the time. So it's actually kind of beautiful in its
and totally clear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's nobody, or not many people out anyway, almost nobody, at least in Chicago. And that was one of my favorite walks. I mean, it was a little hard to unbutton my coat when I, with my frozen fingers by the time I got there. But there is a beauty to that for sure. And it does keep out the riffraff for sure.
Yeah, man. I just love that Prince said that. Cracks me up. So good.
Well, I remember talking to people who would see Prince at the Minnesota Orchestra and just the which is awesome. And I guess that's not surprising, but also like how weird if you're like listening to Mahler and you look over and Prince is there next to you.
Oh yeah. He was such an incredible guy. I mean, there's all kinds of stories, good and bad, about like he was a really like a hard person to work for. I never worked for him, but of course, I have a million friends that did. And but there's also all these stories about him really supporting the arts, and he would do things too in Chanhassen, like rent out the movie theater for the whole night and then just say to all the kids in junior high, like, go see a movie on me, it's free. And he was into his community. He loved Minneapolis, and like he was not unlike somebody like Dylan, who didn't like to talk about that he was from Hibbing or Hastings or one of the H's. Prince was like, oh no, man, Minneapolis is the best. And I feel that way too. I love this town very much.
Yeah. Well, a lot more people know about Lake Minnetonka than would have if they hadn't seen Purple Rains.
Of course. Yeah.
Well, I always thought of that was like my big city, that, and to a much lesser extent, Omaha. But I would go and get bass lessons from one of the Minnesota Orchestra players. Jim Clute was his name. And I'd make my dad would make the drive with me. And we'd go, if we wanted to go see theater, but where the heck, I looked up where you're from in Montana just because I was curious, because even though South Dakota and Montana are neighbors, that doesn't mean that they're anywhere remotely close. And you're like northwestern Montana, right?
Yeah. I'm from a town called Kalispell, which is, essentially like very close to the Idaho Panhandle and Canada, like up in the Mission Mountains. It's called the Flathead Valley, and near Glacier Park. It's beautiful, but it's very remote. I mean, growing up, there was not much. You'd have to drive. The nearest city was Seattle, and it was 9 hours away.
Oh man! Well, I was curious. My last trip before the pandemic broke out, and I know you were mid-tour when this broke out, but I was actually in Moscow, Idaho, and
I know Moscow.
Yeah. Well, there's a jazz festival there, and I was there.
I know.
Oh,
yes. Oh man, my parents used to take me to that when I was a kid, and I came up kind of as a metalhead. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, please.
I came up as kind of a metalhead kid, but my parents were so amazing. And, I played in orchestra and played upright bass and trick, but I remember them taking me to these master classes. I got to see all these amazing people before they passed away. I got to see Dizzy Gillespie, all kinds of great folks. And the Lionel Hampton School of Music, man.
I know. Isn't that crazy? It's.
I feel like we're good.
Froze. We froze for a second. I could hear you though. It's fine. It's good. I don't put out the video anyway. It's just fun to be able to hang out.
Okay.
Yeah, it was so interesting to learn about the history of that, because I think the question most people would have is like, how the heck did Lionel Hampton end up spending a bunch of time in that part?
That is a mystery to me. Do you know that? The answer to that question?
Yeah, I learned a little bit more. Christian Fabian, who's been involved for 25 years, so he may have been there while you were making those trips. He's a bassist for the new Lionel Hampton big band. New York.
Sure.
And so he told me the whole history, and the guy that's running the festival now named Josh Skinner is also a bass player. So there's a lot of bass.
Wow.
But yeah, he just kind of fell in love with that territory because it's very strange, those rolling hills.
Oh, I know.
And there's a beauty to that for sure. And
for sure.
Yeah, he just liked hanging out in that part of the country. That was really the reason. But it's incredible where it draws from. I'm not surprised you went to that festival actually, because I was meeting all these kids from all, and there were a ton of people from British Columbia that came in, a lot of people from Seattle, Eastern Oregon, and it's like that's kind of like the pride of that town is that they have that festival. It's
incredible, man.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was going, it would have been in the early 90s, early to mid 90s. And Brian Bromberg was there every year as kind of like the house bass player. And I mean, the years I probably went 4 years in a row. And the house band, which at the time I didn't care because I was a kid that painted my fingernails black and listened to, you know what I mean?
Yep.
That was me. But it had a huge impact on me. But check this house band out, man. It was Brian Bromberg on bass. It was Herb Ellis playing guitar. It was Elvin Jones on drums and Oscar Peterson on piano. It was insane. And I had no idea, man. I mean, I got exposed to so many things. I saw Diana Krall do a master class and talk about Ray Brown and talk about like what an incredible human he was. And that like every time that he would walk into the room, let alone play a note, she would just sort of like sigh with relief, like, this guy's on my team. And hearing that story about Ray made me want to be like a side musician, a session player,
Wow.
I was so focused on, like my high school band. But I remember someone in her masterclass asked her, like, who's your favorite bass player? And she said, Ray Brown. And everyone, in the know, and of course. And then the follow-up question was why? And she just did this, man. She said, because whenever he walks into the room, I just go, and she let out this sigh. And I thought to myself as a 15-year-old, like, how can I make a talented, incredible, beautiful, like blonde jazz singer, piano player do that? How can I instill that confidence or feeling in someone that I work for? It changed my life, actually. That festival totally changed my life.
Wow. Isn't it incredible how something like that can have such a pivotal effect on what you do? And then also, like, how many 15-year-old kids are in the audience for something that you're doing, that might end up going on to do all sorts of cool things in the music world,
Man, yes, I think about that all the time. I even had my mom set up a lesson with me with Brian Bromberg, and he gave me this 2-hour lesson and didn't charge us. Dude, it's just crazy. And so I had a couple of bad teachers to start with in my hometown. And then I had these incredibly generous experiences with teachers, with pros. And it really just shifted my attitude. And I've been a teacher for a long time. And I have really, because of those experiences, like with Brian, and just seeing the attitude and the generosity and the just like self-awareness of pros at a certain level that don't really have anything to prove and aren't trying to sort of grandstand. It has made me feel really intentional about like the importance of giving information to youth. It's a youth. This is such a terrible, but like when people DM me on Instagram, for instance, when like the 19-year-old kid DMs me and asks about pedal settings or asks about something, I'm happy to tell them because I think that the information should be like a conduit, like free flowing. And if there's any kind of secrecy around that, that's just about the teachers or the pros' self-confidence more than it is about any other issue. So I talk to my students that I do, online now, because here we are in the pandemic. Like, I'm an open book. You can ask me anything. I will tell you any pedal setting. There is no secret. There are no tricks. I am fully happy to show you what I know, because I think that's the only way that then true education moves forward, is without the carrot. Like, well, do this, and then maybe we'll see this sort of like hierarchy of academia. I'm all about give it away.
Yeah, for sure. Give it away, and the doing the work is the challenge, right? It's not the secret, the knowledge of the pedal setting. It's like how do we then apply that and try it again and again and replicate and improve? And
oh, dude, you're so right. I mean, and that's that thing too around like, you know, if you want to build your upper body, like do push-ups.
Yeah.
You can't watch a YouTube video about doing push-ups and build your upper body.
Right.
You actually have to do the work, man. You actually have to do the push-ups. So yeah, you're so right. It's about the info, and then it's about applying that info. You're totally right. Of course.
Well, we had Brian Bromberg up here 2 summers ago. We have this Golden Gate base camp here in San Francisco, and I always bring in a few people, and it was just really cool to spend a few days with him and watch him. And what a cool, you know, I love that, seeing those teacher, mentor, or you know, someone that you work with, someone like that that's giving and generous. And that I remember back when I was 18, maybe Rufus Reed came. I went to Northwestern. Rufus Reed came to Chicago. And
yes, dude. The Evolving Bassist, or what's the book?
Yeah, that's the book. That's the Evolving Bassist.
Yes.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time with that book. I mean, I think he wrote that book in the 70s. Like chapter 1 in that first edition was how to put your bass on a plane. And there's Rufus like in his leather jacket, like putting the bass upside down.
Rad.
Yeah. But he was just like the sweetest. And I had that book, you know, in Sioux Falls, like working out of that book. And then here a few years later, meeting him, the sweetest guy ever. He took us out for some food. He gave us a tape, me and the other bass player at Northwestern. And I mean, it was just absolutely, I was like, wow, this is these barriers that I thought would be there just weren't.
Man. And you know, that experience that I had with Brian, I haven't connected with him. I was 15. And I mean, I remember playing something that I thought was really cool for him. And I'm sure it was so bad, you know. I mean, it was just like I felt like I needed to impress him, so I slapped something on my Yamaha Billy Sheehan Attitude bass.
Yes,
you know, yeah, man. Like I just slapped something frantically and furiously in hopes that he would think I was cool, you know. And you know what he did? He said, "Oh man," he was so nice to me, and he said, "Oh, looks like, you know, you've got some great potential." And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to know how you do that overhand tapping thing." And he said, "Well, before we do that, let's talk about what I'm doing here. Do you know about how to construct a chord? Like, you know, when I'm putting my right hand over my left, I'm playing the root and the fifth of the chord. Do you know what that means?" And I was like, "Oh," and I said, "No." And he said, "And then when my top hand comes up, I'm playing the seventh and the third of the chord, you know, or the 10th, the third an octave higher. Do you know what any of that means?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about chords. And it may not be exactly what you came for, but it is what you need." And I remember being a little bit like bummed out about that, but also I knew that he was right. Yeah. and then because of that one lesson, I went on my own to really dig into, oh, wow, I see these chord tones are how you do everything. It's how you walk a bass line. It's how you think about doing any kind of voice leading stuff. It changed everything. And then I got into modes and, you know, and it was all because someone I admired didn't just give me like a fancy trick and fluff. It's like that thing you're saying. It's like, well, you have to do the work.
Yeah.
He could have said, "Oh yeah, kid, here we go." Yeah. You know,
yep.
But instead he said, "Sure, I get that you want to do that. Here's the reason though that you would do it." Mm-hmm. And it changed my life, man. Anyway, Brian, what a dude.
Yeah, it was incredible. I think it was either that summer or maybe this past summer. Michael Mannering lives here in the Bay Area, and
sure.
Yeah, and what a obviously amazing artist and great person. But it was so cool because he was doing a master class on, I don't remember what we titled it, slap technique or something like that. And I knew that it was going to be mostly 14 and 15-year-old upright players, maybe like 2 electric basses in the room. So I thought, like, how is this class going to go? And Michael is somebody, just an incredible teacher and just like a giving. And it was so cool to watch what he was doing. He just had like left and right hand. He was just doing like right, left, right. Just these very simple. And the whole room was transfixed. And he was looking like he was having the time of his life. You think like this such
cool.
a basic thing, right? I mean, but he was just like taking pleasure. And then, of course, he could sit down and play his, like, I don't even understand what's going on half the time when I'm listening.
Oh, I know.
But it was just cool to see him take such joy in working with people on that kind of level. And it was probably, people were having a blast. They were, smiling and testing it out. And
oh, it's so cool, man. I mean, yeah, and that's the thing, when there are those crossover moments, that's so powerful, right? Because sometimes I feel like we divide ourselves into these camps, right? Of like, oh, well, they're the electric folks and they're the acoustic folks, and there's some doublers, but you kind of have to pick. And it's so cool when you can get an inspiration from either side of the aisle, so to speak,
Yeah.
So cool.
For sure. Yeah, that's such an interesting thing. And that's something that, at least here in San Francisco, it seems like there's much more, and I'm not sure why that is, but there seems to be a lot more crossover, or just maybe it's something about the Bay Area in general, or just the people that have settled here. But yeah, I definitely didn't, back in Chicago, I didn't see as much of that. Obviously, there are people that obviously people double all over the place. But yeah, that's been particularly interesting. We even redesigned our camp t-shirt. So it's like the electric bass, like melding into the acoustic bass and that kind of
dude, I love it. Oh, that's so cool, man. I got to get out to the camp, man.
Yeah, I know.
I know. Come to the camp.
I know. Let's once camps are a thing again, let's get you out here. It would be a blast. And it's
I love that.
Yeah, it's a really cool thing that Barry Green started this camp. He's the guy who wrote The Inner Game of Music and has done a lot of different things.
Yeah.
He started about 22 years ago, and it's just really cool to watch it evolve and over the years. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Cool, man.
Yeah. Now, how did you end up? Did you go directly from Montana to Minneapolis? Did you have some stops along the way, or what was that journey like?
I did, man. I started to play the electric bass and then the upright bass. When I was 13, I met a dear friend who I still make music with. He was 15, I was 13. Oh, that age difference, man. That is like, he was so cool. That 2-year age difference right then is like, oh, I just worshiped everything he did. His name's Dave Young. He's in a great band too called Going to the Sun. They're just wonderful. But he had a brother, right, that was a singer, like, and it was that thing of like, oh man, my brother's a singer. He's out in Minneapolis. And after I graduate, like, let's move out there and rock. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And so at 13, I had this plan. And that's what I ended up doing. Wow. I ended up going to school in St. Paul. I went to McAllister College, but the other guys in the band weren't in school. They were, and we were just gigging and doing that thing. I didn't end up taking I actually never owned an upright until my mid-20s. It was just school basses. But, I played in jazz band and did all that stuff scholastically on upright and electric in high school and college. But really my whole thing was, I was just so excited about being in this band. I was a band guy,
Right.
And that lasted until, we toured all over and had a little record deal. And the ups and downs and the madness of all that. And then when I turned 30, that band had sort of taken, it was like, well, this was sort of winding down. And then it began this sort of process for me of like, thinking about what it would look like to be a side musician and start to really play for other artists. And then that's when really I got back into really enjoying to play the upright again. And because I got called to do that a little bit, but mostly I was an electric bass player for sure. That always just really, my goal on the upright has always been, I want to play with a nice sound. Like I want to be functional on the instrument. Like I want to play with a nice sound and I want to play in tune. And I feel like when I'm in the first couple positions, I'm good. But man, I had this experience. I was in Seattle and I saw the Oscar Peterson trio play. This was probably 10 years ago. It was post-stroke, but Oscar was still killing. And he had a bass player named David Young. Do you know David Young?
The name's familiar.
Okay. Like old white dude, gray hair. they came out, and I remember at the time I had just really jumped back into the upright bass, and I was like super pumped, and I was gonna kill it. I wanted to be the greatest, and I was 24 or whatever. and I will never forget Oscar counting this tune off. He was like 1, 2, 1, 2, and they burn into this thing, but like quiet bebop, and they're all playing the head together. I don't even know what tune it was, but it was burning and like quiet. And this dude, Dave Young, who is interesting because it's the same name as my friend growing up, but that's why I remember it. It was like this guy. He was in the craziest high thumb position, playing this line perfectly, just beautiful, with zero tension, zero effort. And I had two feelings. My first feeling was grief, because at that, I thought, oh, I will never do that. And so I had this grief. And then my second feeling was relief, because I looked at him and I thought, oh, I'll never do that. And so what began for me seeing that happen is I was like, okay, I am going to be an electric bass player. That's going to be like because it's what I love. Mm-hmm. But I also now I need to put away this ambition of being the greatest upright, like as a kid or in your 20s, like I'm going to be the greatest. And I'm like, okay, no, hold on. I don't deserve to be the greatest because I haven't worked for it. It's like, we're going back to this thing about doing the work, right? I hadn't put in the work. Are you kidding me? To play like that, you have to put in all this time and energy, and it has to be your love and your life to get to that level of mastery. I didn't deserve that. But what I decided to do was I just want to back up a singer, back up a band, and have them go, oh, if Ian's on this, it's going to feel good. Mm-hmm. Like I wanted my lack of chops on the upright bass to be a strength, to be like, oh, I'm going to hold it down in this register and really focus on my sound and focus on my intonation and not be tempted to get up into thumb register and like tip the boat over, because I don't deserve those chops. I haven't worked for them, Yeah. And that was a really interesting experience, to see that guy crush right in front of me and think, oh, okay. It's like a fork in the road, and I chose rock. I chose the electric bass and rock and roll,
Well, I'm super curious about Dave Young. No, I actually do know a Dave Young in Los Angeles who's a wonderful player. I don't know if he plays jazz though. He plays with the LA Opera and he teaches at Colburn in LA. And but he very well might. I'll need to ask him. But it might be another. Yeah,
I might have that name wrong, but I feel like his name was David Young. Anyway.
Yeah. Wow. Well, anybody listening, if Dave plays jazz, let us know. It might be him.
Let us know. Yeah.
Now, did you feel? I mean, so I have a lot of friends and colleagues that feel the pull of like you got to move to L.A. I was just talking to a great bassist named Abu Gumroyan, who was here in the Bay Area for many years and subbing in San Francisco Symphony, but lots of electric work and in the Latin jazz world too, especially. And so just moved to L.A. Did you think about relocating? Because I know coming from your neck of the woods, you can get anywhere from Minneapolis about as easily as anywhere else. Maybe one more transfer, but did you feel like you ever at some point had to be in Nashville, or maybe that wouldn't be the right town for you? But you know what I mean. Yeah.
No, for sure. It's such a great question. People don't consider Minneapolis one of the big towns, right? I mean, it's New York, LA, or Nashville, right? The crazy thing is when I just started to do my thing here and really invest in the bands and the people around me in my community, I just found a bunch of work. Mm-hmm. And then I have a family too. So I think like if I wouldn't have chosen to go down the family path, I maybe would have been more apt to move to Nashville or move to Los Angeles. And, of course, like people will say like, oh, you got to just do that. I think I really strongly believe that there is cool stuff going on almost anywhere, mm-hmm. and that you just have to it can't be a grass is always greener situation, right? It has to be like you invest in the place that you are, and maybe you have a plan to move, and that's fine. But I have always been busy. I mean, for the last decade and a half, I have felt like, wow, I don't know that I want more work. I could maybe the quality of work would go up, or like maybe there'd be access to different kinds of work that would be interesting, or maybe even better tours or something. But check this out, man. I was on the road with an artist for a long time playing upright bass. Her name is Lori Limes, a piano player in the Midwest. And I learned a lot on that gig. But then we had our first daughter, and I got off the road. And then this thing happened where I had all this. I was so sad, about like, oh man, I mean, I'm happy to be home, but I miss playing. And then what I ended up doing is really digging into all these gigs that were, not great paying and this and that. But there's a drummer that I love named Michael Bland, who used to play with Prince. He's a fabulous drummer. He's in the new power generation. And whenever he would ask me to do anything, I would always say yes. And I remember he asked me to do a gig, and it was $50, and it was a ton of work. And something that if anyone wants to check me out, what I do on Instagram, my passion is playing synth-based sounds on the electric bass.
Yeah.
It's one of my very favorite things to do. So that's what I was doing for this gig. I made all these sort of Moog bass sounds with pedals on my electric bass. And I remember putting in all this work and thinking, God, I mean, it's $50. What am I doing? And I remember, my wife, who was very supportive, was always also too kind of like, hey, like, is this it? Is this what I'm like, yeah, God, right. But I felt like, I mean, I can't go into a gig and just half-ass it. I've never been able to do that. Never felt good about it. Mm-hmm. And so I remember going into this gig, really preparing, playing my synth bass stuff. And there was a keyboard player who I had never met named Elliot Blofus, who saw me from across the room and said, man, what are you doing? Like, this is killing. Who are you? And he was also killing. And he was the MD for a guy named Eric Hutchinson, who is a singer-songwriter in New York. Yep. And boom, that's how that happened. He said, listen, man, I'm going to have all these friends that are going to be pissed that I didn't ask them. But I can see the amount of work that you put into this $50 gig. And I want that kind of work ethic and that kind of vibe for someone who would potentially sub an Eric's gig. Would you like to do that? I said, are you kidding me, man? Okay, it's all right with me. Watching you watch him rock and roll these tunes I love, man. 2008. I think watching you watch him with 2012. Anyway, I was thrilled, right? And here's, like, if you're listening to this, here's something that is so critical, no matter if you're electric, upright, whatever. It's so critical that you take every opportunity, that you treat rather every opportunity as the most important opportunity you've ever had. And especially if you're young and you have the ability to do that. If you can put in the time to make that $50 gig, to make everybody on that $50 gig go, whoa, like, who is this guy? Yeah. That leads to career, no matter what your instrument. That actually builds career. Yeah. So that's what I have just tried to do. I've seen the fruit of that. And I mean, even, playing with this woman, Lori Line, on the upright bass, I mean, I was not the best upright bass player that she auditioned, but she liked my spirit. She liked how much I prepared. And she said, I'm going to work with you and I'm going to make you a great player. You're going to play with all these wonderful players in this band. And I was in my 20s. And so it's that thing of like really, really diving into your community and deciding that where you are, you're going to crush. And then that will lead to other opportunities, and that might lead you to a new city. But so many people who just have this sort of wanderlust of like, oh, if only I could move to LA, make it happen. I mean, Berry Gordy, think about Motown. Berry Gordy, Aretha was just a girl up the street, man. Yeah. Aretha wasn't a star. Berry just knew her from the neighborhood, really. And the Temptations, those dudes would just sing on the corner by the basketball court, and Berry just knew those guys. And he didn't say, oh, if only I could get to, Los Angeles, if only I could get to New York. Man, he did it in Detroit. Yeah. Right. And that is weird.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah.
Yes, man. I was blown. I went and visited Motown a couple years ago. And of all the things that I took away, I mean, it was an incredible place to see. But of all the things I took away from it, that was the biggest one. That Berry, I mean, and for all his downfalls too. I mean, he was like a businessman, and there's, pitfalls that come along with that. But he, in the beginning, when it was very pure, it was about belief in the community. It was about not this thing of like, oh, I've got to connect. I've got to get put on by this guy who's older and who's a star. No, it was like, I really think that girl named Aretha can sing. And that's it, man.
Yeah.
It just takes, right, the belief in that, and then go.
Yeah.
So I tell all my, this is a long-winded answer to your question, but I always tell students or people that don't live in the big towns, like, sure, move to the big town, but also, like, before you go, who are the people in your community that are crushing? Like, who's the singer-songwriter that you see doing things? Play with them.
Yeah.
Like, don't just think like, oh, I've got to go out and move somewhere and start to play with these guys that are 10, 20 years older than I am. No way. Like, make it happen with your peers. Like, that's what's up.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and that grass is always greener, if only sort of thing that plagues us all. What is it in your control? Well, you can prepare, like you're doing. What the opportunity? Maybe it was the $50 gig, but game recognizes game, right? And so
absolutely
seeing that is something that comes through. I think about that with myself. Like I love electronic music, and I love I've been using Ableton Live forever. I used to teach an Ableton Live high school class, weirdly.
Awesome.
But I, like many people, I fall into the trap of, oh, if only I had that new piece of gear, and then like $10,000 later, I got a bunch of new stuff, and I realized I don't know how to do anything. And as I get older and maybe marginally wiser, I say, hey, Jason, why don't you try to get good with this one thing first, and then you can transfer those skills over. Not that gear isn't awesome, but
oh, I know, and I'm a huge gearhead, but I need to take some of that advice as well. I mean, I'm always buying crap. And the crazy thing for me was I bought a Moog. I bought a little fatty, thinking like, I'm going to do the Keybase thing for real.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and I thought like, I'll learn this in an afternoon. It's just a little keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
And then, oh my God, the depth of analog synthesis, you spend your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like mastering an instrument. It's insane. It's not the piano. It's very different. It's very different. Right. And so I went, again, it's that thing about the upright bass. Like, I don't deserve, like, I would have to put in 10,000 hours. I can't just buy this piece of gear and have entitlement around being good at it. That's insane. And I feel like so many people do that, right? Where you buy something and think like, well, now I spent the money, I should be able to crush this. And no, it doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. So that's what really led me down this path of exploring synth-based sounds with pedals and trying to recreate those sounds with the tools that I really actually feel confident using and feel inspired to use. And then it's funny, when you chase that thing that you love, whatever that is, for me, it was, trying to sound like a computer on an analog instrument. When you really chase that, then people start to call you to do it. Like when you put the time into it and you go like, oh, this is what I want to do. Then people recognize that and see like, oh, it's not a replacement for a Moog. It's not a replacement for, doing like a Novation bass station, sequenced bass line, but it's a different thing. And it's something that not a ton of people do. And I'm so into it. And then people see that and they go, oh, wow, this is interesting. Like, let's have Ian do that thing on this project. Maybe that'll be really cool. And that's just what leads to all this opportunity, right? So I don't need to be in Los Angeles to be curating an Instagram page that really reflects the things that I love. And then I work with people all over the world that say, hey, man, will you play on this thing? And I want you to do that thing. And I'm so thankful to have a thing, something that I feel like, oh, this is something that I do a lot of. But man, it's interesting. You contacted me based on a thing I did on Upright recently.
Yeah, well, so I have this wonderful partner in crime with this podcast named Trevor Jones. He's done much more in the electric world than I am. Was subbing for Hamilton a lot in Chicago and done it all. Whoa. He's a theater bassist in Chicago, and so he said, man, you got to check out this Instagram story that Ian did, and then of course I get to it and it's gone. And so I'm like, Trevor,
shoot, man.
But he explained the gist of it and just recording it, and so I'd love to hear about that. Okay. But I love that you have sort of discovered this thing that people are so into. It's not like people were asking for what you're doing. It's like you were fascinated by this, and your fascination with it, all of a sudden people didn't realize they wanted that. And I think that's just such a great example, because people look for, tab A to fit into slot B or something like that, and that's just a great example of like just being fascinated by something, digging into it, and then all of a sudden, look, it's really incredible. I just think that's a good example of.
Oh man, thank you. Yeah, I'm 41 now, and when I turned 40, I had this midlife crisis of like, my 20s were about being in this rock band, my 30s were all sideman stuff. My 40s and beyond need to include something that I can control.
Yeah.
And so I just really decided to take Instagram really seriously in terms of like giving away information, and really not being at all concerned with what anyone thought of me. Mm-hmm. So being completely happy to post the things that I love dearly. The things from my childhood that I love musically, those influences, how those creep into my playing, and not talk about guilty pleasures, not to, and so when I started to do that, I thought, I don't know if anyone is going to like this, but I love it so much. Like doing a synth bass thing on electric bass and posting about that, or posting about my session process. Mm-hmm. I wish that players that I admire did that. And so maybe there'll be a couple of people that'll pay attention to it. And it's been fascinating to see how many people, and it's not a huge number, but it's built up a group of people that trust the things that I say, that I'm not trying to sell them something. I'm not trying to bullshit them. Yeah. I'm not trying to grandstand and say, oh, look at my amazing life. I'll talk about the sessions that don't go well. Yeah. And it's really been fun and fascinating to see then the things that I'm really passionate about, people buying a couple of little pedals and going, man, I never even thought to do this, but I'm going to dig in. And the thing that you were referring to, that I'm sorry it disappeared, I'll put it up as a highlight on my story. And it was all connected to my bass 6. So I got called to do an upright thing, and it's funny because I'm just not as confident on the instrument as I am on electric. So I always try to pivot like the client into like electric instead.
That's awesome.
Better at it. But this was a thing where this guy that I worked with, this great producer named Kevin Bowe, said, no, man, this really does need to be upright. And I heard the tune and I was like, oh, for sure. It was like kind of like almost like kind of a dark country thing. So I played upright on it. But then I'm so fascinated by like the Nashville 60s country scene. And there was this thing called tic-tac bass. And you may be aware, but it was a style where, there'd be 2 players on a session. Sometimes it would just be like a guitar player and a bass player. The bass player would play upright bass. And the guitar player would play either a baritone, or Fender in the 60s made this cool instrument called a bass 6, which looks like a big Jaguar. So it looks like a guitar, but it's tuned just like a guitar, but an octave lower. And so you play it, you can play it any way you want. It's such a weird and flexible instrument because you can play chords on it, but it's this dark, amazing sound, right? And so what would happen in Nashville was to give the upright a little more like character, or maybe even cut in a mix. There would be these 2 bass players, one playing bass 6 and one playing upright bass, that would get together and talk about how to sync up their line. And they would essentially double one another. And talk about an art form, man. It's just crazy. So I have always been fascinated with that. And I love Glenn Campbell, right? And Glenn Campbell played Wichita Lineman. There's a great bass 6 solo on Wichita Lineman, which if you don't know, man, you have to check it out. It's so hip. It's just like the anti-guitar solo, And so I put a little spring reverb and a little trem on that instrument and double upright with it. And suddenly it's this sound. It's a different thing. And it also just masks my subpar upright playing a little bit as well. But no, really, it's in the spirit of making a vibe. Mm-hmm. Right. Instead of just like, sure, I can play upright on this. Like, well, let's listen to this tune. Does it seem like it needs to kind of tip like dark spaghetti Western? It kind of does. So I'm going to pick up the bass 6 and I'm going to lay that down as well, even though the producer didn't ask for that. That happens to me a lot where I hear music sort of globally, maybe like a producer, I hope like a producer, where I think, boy, I think this could also use this sort of like, spaghetti Western thing, or in the case of a rock thing, like, oh, this could use this big explosion into the last chorus. So I'm going to do like a backward reverb thing. Like I'll send along stems that aren't just bass. And I'll say like, hey, throw this in the trash. It's fine. But I heard this moment, and here is a bass 6 thing that you might use, or here is something that might make this production even cooler. And it's on the house, and typically producers love that. Whether they end up using it or not, the spirit of that is always appreciated,
Man, that's so cool. I would love to know. You're in such a different. Our worlds are adjacent, but not the Venn diagram doesn't overlap quite as much as oftentimes. I would love to know how you work. Like me. I think about this a lot in terms of my practicing or when I'm working on projects, or I do many things in the music world. Do you I could see you just like holding yourself up from like 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. in the studio, and I know you've got a family, so maybe you have that, or are you like walking around with ideas or popping and you're recording in your phone like something, or you just go in and and maybe I'm sure you have many different ways you work, but like just take me through like your process, your musical process.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in COVID, now during COVID, I've got a little studio that I work in. It's just a bedroom that I've converted, that I have some really simple gear. What's really important to me is that I can come into my space and flip a switch and get to work. Mm-hmm. I used to be like shooting out mics and pre's, and I'm a gear guy at heart. So I'd be like, oh, I wonder for this tune if I should plug into this preamp. And that just would always slow me down. So I have my pedal board and my basses, a bunch of electric basses, kind of on either side of me. And I come in and turn on one switch, and then I can start making music right away. So that's really important. Just the speed at which I can get to work, because I love doing it so much that I could spend all day doing it. And I just don't have that luxury anymore. Right. Being a father of 2, and, my wife works, and I just don't have that luxury. But my whole thing about part creation is if there needs if someone says, hey, do your thing on this, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because then there's no parameter. And so you go, oh God, okay, wow, what does that mean? Right. And I love, honestly, when I get references, when someone says this should sound like the Killers, or when someone says this should sound like old country or whatever. I love getting those parameters. But when I don't have those, what I try to do is I listen to the tune in my space without a bass in my hands. That is so critical for me, because if I have the bass in my hands and I listen, I immediately want to discover the changes, and I want to find the key center, and I'm going to start overplaying and playing, shapes around the instrument. And then I just revert to standard things that I've done a million times. Right. Not that that's bad, but it's just not as creative. The best thing, the thing that I would recommend to anybody that's doing sessions is do not pick up your instrument. Sit down wherever you are. I like to be in my studio. Sometimes I just lay on the floor too and put in my, AirPods or whatever, pull the tune up and listen and start to sing a part. So for me, a bass line is just a melody. I think we get really hung up on like, ooh, what's the bass line going to be? I think so much of the time, something that you sing, especially if you are a bass player, something that you sing or that you hum or that you want to hear in your mind comes out in kind of a cool way, rather than, I'm going to follow the kick drum and I'm going to play roots. And like, if you sit down and you sing a part, you can always simplify, or you can always go back to that zone of, just locking in with the drums and playing with the kick drum, but for me, that is the most creative zone when I sing something, because then I'm not thinking about, my Dorian mode or whatever, right? I'm in this real creative zone of, I'm going to come up with a line that might be really cool. And I always send two things too. Not always, but I try to. Like I'll send a safety take, where it's like, hey, if you don't like that fill going into chorus 3, no worries. There's a really nice big old football that you could drop in on the safe take so that the guitar player or that the synth or whatever can do something pyrotechnic into that last chorus. But I will typically be fairly bold about what I send as like what I hear, as long as it's serving the song. I mean, the song is king, right? But I want to come up with something that straddles the line between being, like on one side of this razor wire, you have supportive, and that's the good word, but boring is the bad word. And on the other side of the razor wire, you have creative is the good word, and wanker is the bad word, right?
Yes.
So you have to constantly, for me anyway, I feel that every time I play on something, is it supporting? Good. Ooh, is it boring? Well, we got to tip a little closer to, okay, now is it creative? Ooh, but is it wanker? So I'm always trying to walk that line. It is a tightrope, man. Right. So that's what it is for me. I'm going to try to sing the line first. And then if I find something that resonates, then I'm going to pick up an instrument and I'm going to see if I can walk that line. And then if it's something that needs to be synth or something, then I start to push pedals and have sort of some go-to things that I love there. But yeah, man, it comes first from my brain.
I love that. And somebody needs to come up with an app or a dial or something with that terminology on it, just so you can sort of see where you're walking the line.
Yeah, where are you, man? And I think people have defaults. And for the longest time too, I didn't want to ruffle feathers. So I was always in the zone of like, well, play for the song, which of course, right? But really, simple, less is more. And I do think that that's true, but the stuff that I've been doing more lately, people have wanted a little bit more flex. Mm-hmm. Like people have wanted a little bit more of like, no, man, play something, come up with a part, write a part. I just did a record not too long ago with Corey Wong, and he said, man, this first tune we're doing, I want you to write a sub hook. Like I want the thing that comes out of the gate. It's going to be like Rhodes, drums, and bass. And I want you to be the thing. And so if you haven't spent time thinking about melodies or thinking about parts instead of just, quarter notes or footballs, that's a huge thing to start thinking a little bit, to make sure that you've got your McCartney melodicism on tap, or some of the bass players, whoever was influential to you, that maybe leaned a little more in that creative wanker zone. Like you have to have those abilities, because sometimes people say, hey, you need to play more, or like you need to actually like I want a part. I get asked to do that now more than like just play root notes. It's interesting.
That is interesting. I would take it as a compliment, but that's cool. And that's a great idea though, to have that safety recording like that. That's super.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah, for sure. And it started, I work a ton with this producer in LA named Joey Verscazzi, and he and I are old friends. And, I would send him, and he liked when I would get weird with sounds, and then he'd be like, all right, man, this is cool, but I'm not going to go that direction in this section. So can you send me I love the sound, but can you send me half notes in this section or whatever? And I just got to be where I would just do that for him. Like I knew that, he's going to want an option to just go through this absolutely moment, so I would just start to send him those things in addition to the more, adventurous part.
You were profiled in Bass Magazine, the new venture. Those are great folks, but they're here in the Bay Area. Actually, they were that Golden Gate Bass Camp. They were out this last summer.
Oh, cool!
But it was cool, and so I was reading that, and it was like quarantine checkup or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And you were talking about like a 45-minute practice routine or something like that. It was like the equivalent of what I like to call like musical hygiene, like brushing your teeth or sharpening the blade or something. And it was interesting. It was like 3 parts, and one of them was was like metronome practice where you're subtracting beats, if I remember right, or something like that. Can you talk about what? Because and I might be wrong on this, but I'm assuming when you're doing that, that's sort of probably like a separate process from what we're talking about here in terms of the recording, right? Do you do?
Okay. Yes. I don't get to sit down and do my 45-minute practice regimen as many times as I would like to, or I shouldn't say that. That's a cop out. I don't prioritize that as much as I should. I end up kind of, in more of a grab the bass and noodle or get to work on the thing that I need to do. But I consider it such a gift to be able to sit down with the instrument for 45 minutes. So briefly, what I do, and I think it's for me, it has been the most valuable and fruitful practice session. So I do 45 minutes and I break it up into 3 categories. The first is timekeeping, and timekeeping for me is like super slow metronome exercises. So what I do is I'll set the click at like 20 or 30 and try to play a full bar. And then in my mind, move the metronome around the beats. So if it's going here, I will try to play, and try to make it the 1. But then I'll think 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and still play, right? And then try to put them on the ands, 1 and 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2, and still play. Boom, don't, and so I have a thing around rhythm and around like real intentional playing around grid. I think that it's so important. I think that anyone that says, oh man, playing with a metronome makes my playing stiff, or like, oh man, playing metronome, nah man, that's not how Miles did it, or I think it's such a cop-out. I think that playing with a click is huge. And in so much of the music that I do that is like programmed music, you have to be crushing the grid. Like you have to be very intentional about where you're putting those syncopations and how you're interpreting. Like, are you a tiny bit behind? Are you a little in front? Are you dead on to the best of your ability? And really like making the precision of value. And that's not necessarily in every style of music, but I think that is what separates pros from amateurs, is rhythmic precision. To me, it really, in drum world, it truly separates the pros from the amateurs. Guys that when they start to play, girls too, drop into something and the click disappears. Mm-hmm. That is incredible. And it's hard to do.
Yeah.
So for me, I get in the Zen zone of really spending the time doing 15 minutes up front, doing that kind of practice, very intentional rhythmic playing. Second 15, I'm so sorry. I could talk forever about this stuff now. Second 15 is about theoretical stuff. It's going to be, scales, modes. It's going to be running some things like, man, I need to really work on my melodic minor stuff, like Lydian flat dominant, and I don't really have in my ears, so it's going to be that kind of thing where I'm going to work on a conceptual, theoretical concept. I'm going to really dig into something like that. And then the third is reward system. The third is improv. The third can be, okay, take those things that you've done and now on your looper, put in a nice loop and start to solo over this set of changes using this thing that you or dig into this pedal that you just purchased, right? And really explore what that is, or go on YouTube and find that Michelle Indeggio cello tune from the early 90s. It's so killing off of Plantation Lullabies, and dive in and get hip to her like flat wound jazz bass vibe. Or, it needs to be, it's not so much just improv as it should be inspirational, creative time. Mm-hmm. And I find that then when you've done the work, you've really dug deep and asked yourself the hard questions about your time. You've really sweated out some Lydian dominant or whatever, or you need to run your circle of fifths through, open position scales on your upright or something, right? And then at the end, hey, now it's going to be some time. Maybe I'm going to write a little something. Maybe I'm going to, and I find that when I'm done with those 45 minutes, I don't ever want it to end. I love it. And then maybe sometimes I'll go a little longer, but I find that and even eating the broccoli first, right? Doing the push-ups first, doing the work first, then makes me feel better about being creative. It opens up the pathways to creativity, and it makes me feel certainly just more creative. And then, man, I look at coming back to that, like, then I'm pumped for the next day, coming back and doing that practice regimen again. I'm like, man, I can't wait to do this again. So the 45 315s, man, it's huge.
That's a great routine. I got to try that out. And my college bass teacher would be so thrilled to hear you say that, especially that first part. I remember him having me practice Mozart 40 with the click, just like you're describing, like on the and. I remember thinking, like, what are you talking about? But he was in the Chicago Symphony and I wasn't. Maybe there's a reason.
It's huge, man. And stuff's huge.
That time interval, that like 45, 50 minute, that's like a really good, you read different studies, like different Pomodoro techniques and such. That's a really good chunk of time for like deep focus. And
yeah, man. Yeah. And I think about it too, like working out, like it's hard for me to start doing it, but when I start, I never feel bad that I did, and if you can, I tell my students this all the time, that if you can choose to go from this mentality of like, oh geez, I gotta go get my practice in, to, man, I get this time for me. It's really selfish. It's time that you're not spending with your family. It's not right. Like when I go and choose to put that 45 minutes in, it's time that I'm not spending with my kids. It's time, and so to not think about that as this, albatross, but to think about it rather as, wow, some time that you've carved out for yourself, some like really, really, truly like self-care.
Yeah.
And I think that we tend to think about self-care sometimes, or like zone out, or, as like, Netflix, or like recharge the batteries. But boy, I truly think that if you shift your perspective, you can really think that practice is actually a battery recharge as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there are so many commonalities between that, working out, which is something I just got back from I'm proud of myself, made it up to 8 miles today, trying to get back into running.
Yeah,
I know you got the Peloton bike. I think I read about that. And that's the sort of thing, like, I did not want to get started on that run. I get outside. It's the typical, I'm a total wimp now that I live in the West Coast, and it's a little chilly. It was like 51, and misty. I thought, I don't want to do this run, but I got in, and about a mile in, the blood's pumping, and I'm listening to a podcast, and just sort of like, and then I got back home after that. I was like, that is the absolute best way, and straight up self-care, but charges me up, builds capacity, just like that sort of practicing you're talking about. And
absolutely,
that's beautiful.
It's huge.
Yeah. Ian, please let this be the first of many. The door is open, my friend. I would love to. There's so much that we could talk about. And so let's do this again sometime. I really appreciate it. I know you got to get the kids to the pool and everything.
Yeah, man. I'm going to take them to the pool today.
But
well, it's just such a treat talking with you, man. Thanks for reaching out.
Ian, you rock. Thank you so much for chatting with me. If you're not following with Ian, folks, on Instagram, definitely check him out. We got that linked up in the show notes, or just search for Ian Allison in Instagram. And wow, I just love what he's doing. The production quality that he's doing with these videos reminds me a little bit of Rick Beato. Is it Rick Beato? Is that how you pronounce his last name? His What Makes a Song Great and that kind of thing, but with a very different slant too. And I just love how, like we talked about in our conversation, how open he is, and how giving he is of his time, information, how he's doing what he's doing with everybody, people coming up in the bass world, people who are it's just such a cool, and then what it's done for his career. Again, wow. One of the reasons why I like doing this show is because of the conversation you just heard. It's such a great thing. And I probably would have been watching these anyway, but the fact that I have this platform to be able to connect with people and put out these conversations is just an added bonus to me. I've said that many, many times over the years, so sorry if I'm repeating myself. I'm definitely repeating myself, but that's just how it goes. I hope you are doing well. We are here in lockdown month, I don't even know what, in San Francisco. Feels just like it did back in March, basically only worse, because half the place seems out of business, and now we're experiencing a heat wave and it's fire season, so everything slowly continues to be taken away. Now, even running outside is like smoking a few cigarettes. So not awesome right now, but hopefully things are good on your end or getting better. Or if not, oh well, we're managing. We're still alive. You are somehow still listening to this podcast. So I appreciate you being on this journey with me, this 13-year journey at this point, coming up well into the 700s of episodes. I don't even know what number this is, but it's been fun doing this show. I got to say, it's been particularly nice to have this during this stinking pandemic and everything else that's going on. It's been nice to have a little bit of stability in my life. It feels like this is the only thing that I'm kind of used to doing, that I'm still doing. So I appreciate it. It definitely feels weird to just sit here staring out the window talking to this microphone, but I love how this gets out and reaches the wider world. And when people reach out to me and let me know what they like about the show, who they'd want to hear on the show, topics they'd like explored, that sort of thing, it just makes me realize how connected we all are. And if you want to reach out to me, feedback at contrabassconversations.com is probably the best way to do it, because it just gets into my email. You can message me or DM me on whatever social media platform that's a little bit shakier in terms of actually making it to me. But regardless, I love hearing from people. If you enjoyed this conversation, hey, if you're new, maybe you're new. If you're new and you made it to the end and you're still listening to this, thank you. Oh my goodness, that is super cool. I'm honored. If you're new, welcome. We've got a big old archive, and feel free to dig through. And if I haven't talked about this in months, but if you do want to look for something a little more specific in terms of topics, probably the best way to do that is the app that we have. For 5 years now, we've had a Contrabass Conversations app. It's real simple, no frills. It's got the shows. It's got a few extras that we put together. It looks great on iOS, Kindle, Android. Search for it in your app store, and that's a really good way to drill down into topics. So if you want to look up looping, type looping. And if that has ever been mentioned in the show, it'll be in the show notes, and those episodes will come up, and then you can download those specific episodes. You can listen to them. It's a really cool way to dig into the archives. So just thought I'd mention that, because I haven't in a long time. I sort of forget I have an app. And then I was talking apps with a colleague recently, and I thought, oh yeah, I should talk about the app. So thank you to you for listening. Thank you to the team who puts these together. Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, Mitch Morey, and Krista Copper. And Krista makes I'm not going to edit. Krista may start making basses. Not as far as I know yet. She does wonderful archiving and cataloging for the show. Mitch Morey, however, does make a mean bass in Kilgore, Texas, just east of Dallas-Fort Worth. I was talking to my friend Kate Jones, who's been on the podcast, and she was driving to Mitch's place to get some work done. Mitch made a bass for her. Mitch made a bass that won a silver medal for tone at the last ISB convention. He's doing great work. MitchMoring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.